Distinguished guests and participants, welcome to a very special session of DialoGreen. Today's seminar represents more than a scientific discussion. It is a rare opportunity to connect directly with global expertise at the intersection of wildlife health, biodiversity conservation, and emerging environmental challenges. Wildlife diseases are no longer isolated ecological concerns. They are deeply connected to ecosystem stability, species survival, and even global environmental security. Understanding these challenges requires collaboration between science, conservation, and field based action. It is therefore a true honor to welcome Dr. Heather Fenton, Vice President of the Wildlife Disease Association, whose extensive experience in wildlife pathology and conservation medicine has contributed significantly to advancing wildlife health research and professional training internationally. We also extend our sincere appreciation to the Wildlife Disease Association for its valuable support and its continuous role in strengthening global scientific cooperation, knowledge exchange, and capacity building in wildlife health and disease management. Today's session offers our participants a unique chance to explore real-world perspectives, scientific challenges, and practical approaches shaping the future of wildlife conservation and ecosystem health. Thank you, Dr. Heather. Now you can proceed. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. So my name is Heather Fenton. I'm actually from Canada originally, but I'm living in Australia. And I just wanted to acknowledge that this is a quote from Isaac Newton, but it's basically acknowledging that the reason that we have often progressed in many ways, especially in science, is because we stand on the shoulders of giants, or we often have mentors and other people that are supporting us along our journey. So it's often kind of a collective group that we often are very grateful for. So I did want to give a little bit of a background about kind of where I'm coming from and where I've worked and my experience. I've never actually been to Egypt, sadly, but maybe one day I can visit. So I was actually born in Yellowknife in Canada, which is very far it's very far north in Canada. It has very different weather. There's lots of snow and it gets very cold. But I mostly grew up in Edmonton in Alberta. So this is kind of the middle of Canada. And I went to the University of Alberta and I studied biology. And I was very interested in ecology and conservation. But I was also interested in medicine and kind of understanding physiology as well, and understanding how I could apply kind of medical features, specifically veterinary medicine, towards ecology and conservation. So I decided to go to veterinary college at the University of Saskatchewan. So this is still kind of in the middle of Canada. And that's where I learned about the Wildlife Disease Association, and that's where I started getting involved when I was a veterinary student. So that was quite a long time ago now. But after graduation, I worked in a number of mixed animal veterinary practices. So I was doing small animal and large animal medicine. And one of my favorite things to do while in mixed animal practice, this was in very small towns in Alberta and Saskatchewan. My favorite thing to do was to kind of investigate for diseases. So my favorite thing to do was to do necropsies on animals and try to figure out what's going on, because I liked the idea of trying to figure out a puzzle or trying to decide what's going on. So I decided to do a residency in anatomic pathology, so a specialization after veterinary school, and that was in Prince Edward Island in Canada, on the eastern coast of Canada, so the Atlantic Veterinary College. And that's when I sort of just started with the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, which is a national group within Canada that focuses on wildlife health surveillance within the country. And after I graduated from there, I guess focusing on wildlife in particular, I decided to move into the southeastern United States because there was an opportunity there from an equivalent kind of organization called the Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study. And this group has done a lot of research on wildlife diseases. It started in the 60s investigating diseases of white-tailed deer, in particular one that's called hemorrhagic disease. So it's similar to blue tongue virus that causes disease sheep and cattle. So I spent a number of years there, and then there was actually an opportunity to move back to Yellowknife, so where I was born, and I was the wildlife veterinarian for the government of the Northwest Territories. So in this role, I was looking at wildlife health surveillance all throughout the territory, which is a very large geographic area, but very sparsely populated and very remote. So many of the locations and communities that I was working in, you could only get there by plane. Many of the people in those communities depended on hunting and fishing for their food. And so we were involved in making sure essentially that that food was healthy and how maintaining kind of stable populations of these species. Then I worked at Ross University School of Veterinary Medicine, and I was teaching veterinary pathology there because I do have a love of teaching and pathology. And that was in St. Kitts in the Caribbean, which is a very different climate again from Yellowknife. But I really enjoyed my time there. It's a beautiful place and a beautiful place to live. But I still kind of had this love of wildlife health and wanting to kind of really focus on wildlife health. So at the moment, I work at the Australian Registry of Wildlife Health, which is in Sydney in Australia. We're based at the Taronga Zoo. We've been present for 40 years, and it's a team of just 4 people. We're not a big team, but we focus on studying wildlife pathology in Australia. Do you want me to stop, or do you want me to keep going?
No, you can keep going.
Okay. So I'm going to talk to you, I guess, about some different aspects of how I think that veterinary medicine can be applied to conservation. And all of this is kind of centered around the mission of the Wildlife Disease Association, which is to promote healthy wildlife and ecosystems, biodiversity conservation, and environmentally sustainable solutions to One Health challenges. So we're often focusing on promoting a One Health approach to big problems. And why should we care about this? Why should we care about diseases in wildlife? Well, first of all, many of these diseases that actually come from wildlife originally can cause significant harm to people, as we're seeing right now in many parts of, and unfortunately some parts of Africa related to the Ebola epidemic. So Ebola virus originates in wildlife species, and when there's increased conflict and increased issues within the countries, also associated with land use changes and climate change, we see this interface between wildlife and humans, and that there's these spillover events essentially that occur into humans, and that is where ultimately these viruses come from, and then the situation is just made significantly worse, associated with a lot of issues in those areas. So we should really understand what the triggers are for spillover and how we can prevent them. And we're beginning to understand that having making sure that there's space for wildlife and where wildlife can be present, it actually decreases the risk of these spillover events occurring, because these events can unfortunately cause a significant amount of harm to human communities. But we also care about the wildlife themselves. So there's a disease of bats that has kind of emerged in North America around 2006 in the United States, and it's termed white nose syndrome. So it has caused some significant destruction of bats. And why do we care about that? Well, because bats are essential for the ecosystems that we rely on. Bats are essential pollinators. They are significant in terms of making sure that there's many crops that humans depend on that are actually pollinated by a number of these animals. And so the service that they do in terms of pollination, as well as insect management, so preventing destruction to crops, for example, because of those insects, is significantly valuable. It makes these species really valuable to overall ecosystems. So white nose syndrome is caused by fungus. You can see the white sort of furry growth around its muzzle, and it is causing some very significant declines of a number of species of small bats or microbats in North America. to the point where it's of conservation concern. So another significant One Health disease that's emerged recently is highly pathogenic avian influenza. So these are two pictures. They're essentially just a year apart. So it's a gannet colony in Scotland, and you can see that the numbers of birds that are actually nesting in that colony declined just within a year's time. So we're seeing incredibly quick declines in wildlife populations because of essentially of this virus that has emerged. And it's also resulted not only in the destruction of a number of wild bird species, but it's also resulted in significant outbreaks in domestic poultry, which has affected the economy and the significantly the poultry industry. So why do we think veterinarians and pathologists are important to wildlife health? Because I tend to think that we are superheroes, and I guess in our own way. And that's because what we do is understand how we identify diseases. So we, as veterinarians, we know how to do field investigations. We know how to sample live animals as well as carcasses. We know important things in terms of keeping sterile environments. We know how to make sure that the quality of the sample is really important, because the quality of our diagnostic outcome is going to depend on the quality of that sample. So we're understanding. So we're talking about kind of the veterinarian being someone that's going to be kind of at the center of investigations or trying to understand, bigger events, what's going on, because the someone in the center is going to gain information from a number of different sources and specialties to try to kind of put the whole bigger picture together. And that is why I like pathology, because it's often trying to put the puzzle together. So it is important to understand a certain basics about health and disease. And one of those is that infection is not the same as disease. So sometimes animals that are really healthy, they have good nutrition, they're not stressed, they don't have other issues that they're dealing with, they're not going to come down with disease. When they get infected, their immune system is potentially going to be strong enough to fight it off. But when that animal or person is maybe immunocompromised because they're very stressed out, maybe it's there's a lot of development going on in the area, maybe they're having trouble finding food, they have to travel further distances to find food, they have to compete with humans for certain areas, they're facing other issues, maybe like they're trying to avoid vehicles or something like that. Maybe their nutrition is not as good, then they tend to be more susceptible to disease. Maybe they're also exposed to a number of pollutants in the environment, and those are affecting their immune system and making them more susceptible to disease. So it's important when you're gaining all of this additional information from those other specialties that you can interpret those results in terms of how significant they might be. And so one example of this you might be familiar with in veterinary medicine, but it's called the FAMACHA scheme, and it's related to the amount of parasitism that an animal might have. It's usually a goat or a sheep. And so it means that we don't necessarily want to treat animals all the time with mild infections, because then we're just creating situations that are making it worse for resistance. And those, the therapeutics that we have to use won't necessarily work as well over time. So what it means is that you're only treating animals at a certain stage, ideally at more of kind of the later stages of potentially being affected by these nematodes. And this also kind of saves the farmer money, because it means that they're not unnecessarily treating animals that don't necessarily need to be treated. So this is just a sort of how we can apply those, how infection is not necessarily the same as disease in real time. So what does cause disease? So often it's triangulation or association of the integration between host itself, So if they're healthy, if their immune system is good, what other stressors they might have, if they're also avoiding other things like predators, if it's breeding season or they're a female and they're pregnant or lactating, those are all different situations for the host that can impact their ability to become diseased. The agent itself. So we all know that there are different strains of viruses. There's different strains of bacteria. Some of them are producing much different virulence factors than others, and so that can impact how the agent is causing disease. And then the environment. And so this is very important for wildlife because the wildlife are definitely existing within the environment. So when you have a perfect storm, you'll get a situation where all of those things lead to potentially that animal becoming diseased. So all of these pictures are referring to epizootic hemorrhagic disease. So this is similar to blue tongue virus. It's an orbivirus. And what you're seeing in the center is an animal that is affected. So it's got that characteristic blue tongue. We see different levels of disease based on the level of immunity in the population. So we see kind of this band where we're seeing cases and we see differences in how the disease presents based on where essentially where that animal has lived, because in some areas like the southeastern United States, the animals have much higher levels of immunity than in the northern areas of the state. And so in the southern areas of the state, we'll see this acute disease. So they'll have acute death, they'll have pulmonary edema, kind of the classic lesions, hemorrhage of blue tongue. But in the northern parts of the United States, they actually get chronic lesions. So they survive that acute phase and they develop immunity, but they actually still have issues in their blood vessels that cut off circulation to their hooves, and then they get growth abnormalities of their hooves. And so these are host factors that are impacting whether or not that animal gets disease. And then the agent itself, we're talking about the virus in many cases, or bacteria, parasite. But in a lot of cases, we also know that there's other animals or insect vectors, arthropod vectors that are important in the transmission. So the environment is important in terms of whether or not where that animal lives in terms of how it's developing immunity, but it's even more important when it comes to the insect vector. So what environmental factors in terms of temperature, humidity, levels of rainfall, for example, are going to create the best environment for that host. And that's where we're seeing a lot of changes with vector-borne diseases associated with climate change, because that environment is changing. And so those vector hosts can move and start to be present in areas where they weren't normally present before. And because we live in a global world, it's easy for those tiny little vectors to easily hitch a ride on an airplane or a boat sometimes, and then go into new locations. So as veterinarians, we also spend a lot of time learning about laboratory tests. And this is an example of why they're actually required. So these are all deer that are presenting with illness. So they all look very sick, and they all have different reasons why they're actually sick. And so just by looking at them, we can't necessarily diagnose exactly what's wrong with them. But what I can tell you is that the deer over here has a brain abscess associated kind of with fighting. This is a male that has likely been fighting with some other males. This animal is affected by hemorrhagic disease. It's actually having trouble breathing. And this animal has chronic wasting disease, so a prion disease resulting in neurologic degeneration and eventually emaciation. So we do need some laboratory diagnostic tests to tell the difference between those three different diseases. But we also know, especially from COVID, that no test is ever 100%. There's always reasons why the test could be negative or the test could be positive. So we can also be aware that we need to interpret things in a reasonable manner. We know that there's many different types of studies to basically help us evaluate and decrease the chances of getting false negatives and false positives. But we also know, like I said before, what might be required to maximize the quality of these diagnostic testing. And we also learn in veterinary medicine the Hippocratic Oath. So this came from ancient Greek philosopher Hippocrates. And basically what he said, kind of as the father of modern medicine, is that we want to first do no harm. So as members of the medical community, we don't want to create harm to our patients or, you know, potentially other animals. How are we doing? Do you need me to?
اوكي، الدكتور كانت بتتكلم في واي ليه السبب انه في الوايلد لايف احنا بنحتاج ان احنا ندرس الوايلد لايف، وبنحتاج ندرس الوايلد لايف ديزيز او الامراض في الوايلد لايف، علشان معظم الامراض او معظم الوباءات بتطلع او بينشأ مصدرها اولا من كائنات غالبا بتكون وايلد. وبالتالي احنا محتاجين ان احنا نفهم اكتر عن العلم ده، ومحتاجين ان احنا نفهم اكتر الكائنات دي كوايلد ايه اللي بيحصل معاها في امراضها، علشان احنا كبشر كمان ان احنا نقدر نحمي نفسنا منها. وكمان لو احنا الكائنات دي بتدخل في زي الزراعة، زي كائنات زي البقر والخرفان والكائنات دي، فاحنا ان احنا نقدر ان احنا نحميها من انتشار الامراض، وبالتالي احنا ما نخسرش ايكونوميكلي او اقتصاديا. وكانت بتحكي في فكرة انه في نورث امريكا وفي امريكا وكندا الباتس او الخفافيش كانت بتتعرض لامراض، وده كان بيسبب مشاكل لان هم الكائنات البولينيترز او اللي بتلقح النباتات هناك. فلما الكائنات دي بتتعرض لانهيار في البيئة بتاعتها او بتتعرض لامراض كتير، النباتات اللي كانت بتعتمد عليها كانت برضو بتتأثر. وبالتالي ده كان مثال هي الدكتور عرضته، ده كان مثال الدكتور عرضته في ان احنا ليه بنهتم بالوايلد لايف ديزيز، وانه عشان كده الكائنات البريه بدات تدخل في الكونزرفيشن او مجال حمايه البيئه. وبعد كده الدكتور كانت بتشرح العلاقه ما بين الهوست، الكائن اللي بيبقى فيه المرض والكائن المسبب للمرض والبيئه، وان الثلاث عوامل دول بيرتبطوا ببعضيهم في المثلث اللي الدكتور عرضته، وانه احنا لازم نهتم بالثلاث جوانب علشان احنا نقدر نتحكم في انتشار الامراض او الاوبئه اللي ناتجه من الكائنات البريه. ولازم نهتم بكل فاكتور من دول علشان ان احنا نقدر ان احنا نتحكم في الاوبئه صح، ومفيش فاكتور واحد بس ينفع نهتم بيه، لازم نهتم بالثلاثه بالظبط. ده التراينجل او ده المثلث اللي الدكتور كانت بتتكلم فيه. ده كان الملخص المعلومات المهمة اللي الدكتور عرضته. والدكتور برضو كانت بتتكلم في فكرة انه الوايلد لايف سبيشيز او الكائنات البرية، الامراض اللي بتتعرض لها برضو بتزيد مع اختلاط البشر معاهم وقرب المستعمرات البشرية منهم. ده بيزود نسبة تعرض البشر للامراض المنتقلة من الكائنات البرية، وانه نسبة الامراض دي بتزيد او الاوبئة بتزيد بسبب الكلايمت تشينج او تغير المناخ. وان احنا لازم نفهم التريجرز اللي بتسبب الامراض دي علشان احنا نقدر نتحكم اكتر في الاوبئة، وفي نفس ذات الوقت ان احنا نقدر نحمي الكائنات البرية وما نخسرهاش، فنحمي التنوع البيولوجي بتاعنا. ده كان ملخص المعلومات المهمة اللي الدكتور عرضتها لحد دلوقتي. You can proceed, Dr. Heather. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I'll just try to maybe answer a question too. So it's a question about kind of the environment being one of the main reasons for diseases in wildlife, but animals understandably will live in different environments like the jungle or the forest, and how we can kind of maybe assist in preventing disease. And it is a good question, and I should mention that wildlife have, just like sheep and just like dogs and cats, there are certain parasites and that even bacteria and viruses that we normally live with, or they normally live with as well. And so those are often kind of normal parts of their life. And so when they were living in their environment, they're sort of adapted, I guess, to live with that flora. So things are often kind of okay. They don't necessarily develop disease. But what happens sometimes is that because we're cutting down the trees in the forest, for example, or we're, humans have moved all over the world. And we've also brought with us sometimes animals that weren't normally present there. And those animals often carry, viruses and bacteria that those other animals that were living normally in the jungles and the forests were never exposed to. And we see that often in wildlife, where disease happens because that animal wasn't exposed to that agent ever before, but when it's exposed to kind of an agent from somewhere else, it causes disease. And then the other thing that we're seeing are things like increased stress from the environment that is often, associated with humans. So because we're making it harder for them to find food because we've cut down all the trees, we're making it harder for them to find shelter, for example. Sometimes it's actually better. So when you cut down the trees, maybe it's easier for the some predators to find that animal. So there's some animals, do well with people and others don't. But we're getting some of these increased pressures and stress in many cases, and we're seeing effects of that essentially in increased disease. So hopefully that maybe somehow helps answer some of the question. But it's very complicated, and each sort of system is somewhat different. But kind of as a generalization overall, what we've seen is there's increasing human impact on biodiversity and wildlife. And so the story that I wanted to tell is about vultures. And I know that Egypt has vultures. I don't know much about wildlife, but I also sort of was reading that the eagle is the national bird, and so raptors are very important to Egypt. So you probably have maybe seen a vulture. These vultures are from India, and so the story is related to not wanting to do more harm as medical professionals. And so the story of these vultures is that there were these massive declines in vulture populations in certain parts of India. And it turns out that the cause was related to veterinary drugs that were being used to manage pain in cattle. And so we were, as veterinarians, were unfortunately part of the problem that these eagles were facing. But of course, because we understand what's happening now, and veterinarians assisted in trying to understand the disease, we can also be part of the solution. So now there's a number of different guidelines and rules that have changed in a number of countries, and we can learn from these situations so now there's different, more safe painkillers out there for cattle. And all of that's actually present in this report. If you're interested, this is a relatively recent report that came out of WOA, and so you can actually find that online and read it. But it was an alarming situation where vulture populations were declining quite rapidly. And it was a veterinary pathologist who's one of my colleagues named Dr. Carol Matila, and she's from the United States. And what she says is that what pathologists do is look for patterns. And so she was seeing lesions that she had seen about 10 years ago, and it was helping her to understand what was going on in the current cases. So what was going on is that one of her colleagues, I think, reached out to her and was able to kind of do a necropsy on some of these vultures and sent her the blocks of paraffin embedded tissue. And she looked at them and she saw this is kidney from the vultures, and there's these sort of shaded areas, which this is another example. This is from the textbook Pathology of Wildlife and Zoo Animals. So there's these sort of spicules and purple structures that are surrounded by, these are inflammatory cells. So they're macrophages, multinucleated giant cells, and they're located in the kidney. So these are specific sort of mineralized foci that are typical in the response, or gout. It's essentially gout in the response to anti-inflammatory drugs. And so what happened was they were able to get in touch with the government representatives in India and inform them that it is likely that veterinary drugs are causing the death of these animals. And so there's subsequently been changes, as I mentioned, as well as warnings for others in different areas that what we use in veterinary medicine can have some impacts on the larger ecology. And vultures are essential to ecology because they're part of the natural system, and they're helping break down, recycle kind of nutrients within the system. So as veterinarians, it's another kind of reminder of what drugs that we use can have impacts on other species, and ultimately these impacts can actually come back to ourselves as well. So what we're also seeing now is an increase in antimicrobial resistance, and veterinarians definitely have a role to play in preventing further kind of emergence of antimicrobial resistance. And then by responsible use of veterinary drugs, we can be protecting our own health in the future, because there's obviously certain synergies between what we do in veterinary medicine and what is going to potentially be harmful to humans in the future. And then we know what other people are seeing is potentially that there's these links and intersections between a lot of threats going on to wildlife, and ultimately what we're doing is impacting ourselves in the long term negatively if we don't have a bigger plan or address some of these issues. So as we also want to make sure that the welfare of the animals are maximized. That's sort of another focus of veterinarians. And so often what we might do in many cases is we'll attach different satellite tags or collars, or we'll try to be, we want to be able to count the animals. We want to be able to monitor the animals and see how they're doing over time, because that's all part of kind of understanding the ecology of these species. We want to look for population trends over time. We want to know where they're moving. We want to, like, we're doing it because we want to help them. But in some cases, the tools that we use sometimes can cause harm. So this is an example where transmitters were put to the body cavity of brown bears. And it was a veterinary pathologist and folks that were doing the examination, and they found that these transmitters were causing significant reactions, and it was causing the death of a couple animals. So then once we knew that was happening, they decided we're not going to do this type of intraperitoneal transmitter again, and so we're going to have to look for a different solution. And then we publish this in a scientific journal so other people know about it, and they don't do it, and we're preventing more harm to these animals. Then I did want to kind of highlight just a couple of stories where the group that I've been involved in has been helpful in preventing extinctions and associated with different conservation projects. And so one example of that is the Christmas Island skink, Christmas Island lizards. So Christmas Island is located it's associated with Australia, but it's actually closer to Indonesia. And a number of the species that live on that island, it's very famous from David Attenborough, actually. A number of the species only exist on that island. And there's some of these reptiles that actually don't even exist in the wild anymore. They only exist in captive colonies on the island. And so they have these captive breeding facilities on Christmas Island because they're trying to breed the animals in captivity and then release them into other locations. And they have successfully been releasing animals into different islands, Cocos Island and others, for example. And the reason that they're not doing well on Christmas Island is because of the introduction. Like I mentioned earlier, humans have brought a number of species with them when they've colonized different areas, and those species can have a lot of harms on the native wildlife. And so what was emerging in these captive bred reptiles was this emerging disease. And it was a mystery, and we didn't know what was going on. And so they had these kind of really striking skin lesions. They had essentially kind of like multiple areas of inflammation. So these look like granulomas in multiple organs, swelling of the face. It was present in the bone and in some cases. And so what this looks like microscopically are these chains of bacteria. So these are all gram-positive coccoid bacteria, and they're forming chains and they're kind of within this loose matrix. And so this is what it looks like with an electron microscope. So you have this loose matrix surrounding these coccoid bacteria. Sometimes they're forming chains. And this matrix is actually like a biofilm. So it turns out that this was an emerging bacterium called Enterococcus lacertiforme. So it was actually named after that reptile. And it's a contagious pathogen, essentially. So then the importance of biosecurity became very important. So the folks that were doing the breeding program, so these are all folks on Christmas Island that have this breeding program for these endangered lizards that are essentially pretty much extinct in the wild. They had to enforce some very strict quarantine procedures. They had to separate certain animals. They had to make sure that they were using the right PPE. They were using disinfectants, excuse me, so that the other animals were prevented from getting infected, and that's what worked to manage the pathogen. So these are all kind of basic biosecurity features. There's no treatment and no vaccine for this particular pathogen, so you have to kind of go back to basic biosecurity. And then it turns out that one of our colleagues who's in the United States, Dr. Rob Ossoboff, heard Carrie give a talk at a scientific conference and describe this disease, and he found the same lesions in Florida in a brown anole. So that's a lizard that's in Florida. And so he's suspecting that because of the pet trade, which is a big problem globally, and I was reading it's a very big concern in Egypt at the moment as well, that because there's a lot of lucrative trade in species kind of all over the world that's unregulated, and so we get the introduction of different pathogens into different areas. And so the thought is that this is linked likely, and there's concerns about this and other pathogens moving around the world with the pet trade. So another, this is more, I guess, of a possible successful story, is another sort of disease that came about in Australia. And so there was this endangered turtle that lives only kind of in a certain river in New South Wales in Australia. And this is what they look like. And a mysterious disease popped up and it was causing mass mortality in these animals. So our group, Jane, who's in our group here, went out and sampled a number of different species in the area for, first of all, I guess I should say that they discovered it was likely a virus, but it was a newly described virus that hadn't been seen before. And the virus causes significant lesions around the eye. So it actually targets the lacrimal glands and prevents the animals from, causes some severe necrosis in the glands around the eye, as well as conjunctivitis and facial swelling, and then some necrosis in some other organs. So it was definitely not a good virus for the turtles, but we thought maybe this did come from the pet trade or some other trade, and it was introduced into the river unsuspectedly. Sorry, I think there must be a timer. So our folks went out and they sampled a whole bunch of different species that would normally be present in the river to see if we could figure out which host was the source potentially of this virus. And they were all actually negative. But there was a lot of research that went into this, and it turns out that this is a new pathogen or a nidovirus that is affecting these turtles. And how we have responded is the animals were actually brought into captivity, and now we have captive breeding programs and release. So there's certain situations when the population gets so low that the animals are kind of brought into captivity and then given a head start and ultimately released back into the wild. And so we have an existing program today of breeding and rearing these turtles. So we've got veterinarians involved in diagnostics, in understanding the epidemiology of diseases, and then awareness that our treatments are going to potentially have an impact on other animals, and then ultimately antimicrobial resistance as well. captive breeding programs. So there's lots of different ways that veterinarians can sort of slot in and be involved in conservation programs, conservation breeding as well. There's lots of reproductive technologies being used. But I did want to mention a couple other tools that are used potentially in wildlife management. And this goes back to some kind of one of the premier papers that came out of our journal with the Wildlife Disease Association, the Journal of Wildlife Diseases. And this was a discovery from Tom Thorne and Beth Williams. And so they were a couple that were really involved in the 80s and early 90s of wildlife health. And so we actually have an award that's named after both of them. And what they were involved in are a number of diseases, but also this one in particular, which is canine distemper. So this is a morbillivirus, and it was negatively impacting black-footed ferrets, which are an endangered species in the United States. So these are the original kind of papers. They're in black and white. And you can see that this is a eosinophilic intracytoplasmic inclusion body. This one that the arrow is pointing to is in the nucleus. So these are classic lesions of canine distemper virus. It's infecting those epithelial cells. And you have the characteristic lesions of this disease where you've got hyperkeratosis or skin sloughing and thickening of the foot pads and the muzzle and around the face. So these are we know this is a virus. We know it likely did come from dogs, eventually domestic dogs, and it's negatively impacting this endangered species. So, but it turns out there's actually a vaccine available for this virus. So this is part of the routine vaccinations that we do give domestic dogs. And so those vaccines were utilized in these ferrets as a wildlife management tool to prevent them from having disease. And it's actually still in use in a number of areas. But as you can imagine, it takes a lot of work to maybe inject a number of individual invasive species, or not invasive, individual endangered species. It still takes a while to do wildlife immobilizations and anesthesias if we're going to kind of try to go out and vaccinate wildlife species. It's a considerable effort, especially if they're widely distributed on the landscape. So there's even newer technology these days where we're looking at doing different types of vaccination for different pathogens. And so this one is an example. And it turns out that the ferrets also get disease. They also get a different disease. Now that we know how to manage canine distemper, they get this other disease that causes problems, and that's plague, so Yersinia pestis. And that causes disease in the black-footed ferret and the prairie dogs that the black-footed ferret eats. And so we know that the prairie dogs are important in this kind of disease ecology of this system. And so it turns out that the prairie dogs can be vaccinated for plague with these baits that they eat. So we're looking at different ways to deliver vaccines in wildlife that are much more cost effective. And they've been trialed in a number of different examples. So for example, we do oral baiting for rabies. So we have an oral rabies vaccine that's in use for raccoons and some other mesomammals in North America. There have been oral baits for wild boar, for bovine tuberculosis in use, and now there's plague. And then there's also some research on a potential vaccine for white nose syndrome that I was mentioning in bats as well. So we do have some new tools coming about that are potentially going to be helpful.
اوكي. احنا الدكتور لما رجعت تتكلم كانت بتتكلم في بوينت مهمة جدا، وهي انه قرب المستعمرات البشرية تاني من الكائنات البرية بدأت تعرضهم للكائنات المستأنسة زي القطط والكلاب، وده بدأ ان هو يعرض الكائنات البرية دي لأمراض وباثوجينز مختلفة عنهم، هم ما كانوش بيتعرضوا لها في الطبيعي، وبالتالي الكائنات البرية دي او الحيوانات البرية ما كانش عندها مناعة اتجاه الباثوجينز او الامراض اللي الكائنات المستأنسه زي القطط والكلاب بتنقلها ليهم. فده بيسبب اكتر ان نسبة انتشار امراض في الوايلد انيمالز بين الوايلد انيمالز انها تزيد. وكان الاكزامبل اللي هي عرضته ان هو كان في فولتشرز، نسور في الهند، فجأة هم ابتدوا يلاقوا ان الاعداد بتاعتها بتقل بشكل كبير جدا. ولما اكتشفوا، لما حاولوا يعرفوا هي ايه السبب وعملوا الاوتوبسي او شرحوها وحاولوا يعرفوا ايه السبب، اكتشفوا انه الحبوب اللي بتتاخد الكاتلز زي البقر والجاموس والحاجات دي، الحبوب اللي هم بياخدوها او الادويه اللي هم بياخدوها بتأثر نيجاتيف على النسور اللي بتتغذى على البقر والجاموس لما بيموت، لان النسور كائنات. وبالتالي من هنا بدأ فكرة انه لا، احنا لما نبتدي نركز في الادوية اللي احنا بنديها، احنا بنفكر في الكائن اللي احنا بنديله الدواء، وبنفكر كمان الدواء ده ممكن يأثر على مين تاني، فانه ده ممكن يأثر على الكائنات التانية زي النسور في الحالة دي. وكمان بدأوا ان هم يركزوا، طب احنا لو احنا كبشر بنتغذى على الجاموس او البقر او الخرفان او كده، فاحنا كمان لازم نركز في الادويه علشان هو ايه الافكت اللي ممكن يجي لنا احنا كبشر لما ناكل يعني الكائنات دي او نتغذى عليها. فالوايلد الوايلد فيترينيريانز او الدكاتره البيطريين اللي متخصصين في الوايلد مش بس بيهتموا بالويلفير بتاع الانيمال او صحه الحيوان ذات نفسه، لا هم كمان بداوا يركزوا في الدواء ده انا لما بديه هو بيأثر على مين تاني، سواء كائن تاني بيتغذى على الكائن اللي انا بديله الدواء، او في الحاله بتاعتنا الانسان. كان في اكزامبل تاني هي عرضته الويلفير اوف انيمال، لما بداوا يحطوا راديو الرادارات اللي بتشتغل بالراديو في البراون بيرز. لقوا ان الرادارات دي هم حاطينها علشان يتتبعوا الدببه البنيه، وهما يعني كان هدفهم كويس، بس لقوا ان الرادارات دي او الراديو دي بدأت تعمل التهابات في جسم الكائن. فعملوا رسالة وبحث عن الموضوع ده ونشروا النتيجة بتاعتهم عشان يلفتوا نظر البيطريين التانيين انه لا، الشيء ده بيسبب اذى للكائن اكتر من النفع بتاعه، فاحنا محتاجين ان احنا نلاقي طريقة تانية نقدر نتتبع بيها الكائن الوايلد ده او ايا كان الكائن اللي احنا بنتعامل معاه، بحيث ان احنا ما نسببلوش اذى في الاول وفي الاخر. فالوايلد لايف سوري الوايلد انيمال فيترينيريان او الطبيب البيطري بيحتاج ان هو يفكر في كذا اتجاه، مش بس في الكائن اللي هو بيعالجه. كان في البوينت اللي بعد كده البيت تريد، ودي كانت برضو من ضمن الاسباب من ضمن الفاكتورز اللي بتنتج من الوايلد لايف كونفليكت او الصراع ما بين البشر، انه البيت تريد اللي هو البيع بتاع الحيوانات ونقل الحيوانات من بيئة لتانية ومن بلد لتانية ومن القارة لتانية. فده كان الاكزامبل بتاع السلحفة اللي هي عرضتها، دي كانت سلحفة بتعيش في النهر، والمفروض ان بيئة السلحفة دي مش بتعرضها للباثوجين او المرض، الكائن الناقل للمرض اللي هم لقوه في السلحفة دي. فلما بدأوا يركزوا اكتر اكتشفوا ان او البيع للحيوانات او نقل الحيوانات من بيئة لأخرى هو كان السبب في ان السلحفة دي تتعرض للمرض ده. والمشكلة انه السلحفة دي موجودة على الكوكب بقالها سنين كتير، بس هي ما عندهاش مناعة للمرض ده لان هي ما تعرضتلوش قبل كده، بس هي اتعرضت للكائن ده او الكائن المسبب للمرض ده في الفترة الأخيرة، في العدد السنين القليلة في الأخيرة. فهي مش لاحقه انها تعمل مناعه ضده، وبالتالي ده كان بيسبب ان اعداد السلحفه دي بتنهار بسرعه شديده. حتى هي عرضت صوره انه لما الاعداد بتقل جدا بيضطروا ان هم ياخدوا الكائنات دي في مكان زي حضانات او اماكن يتزاوجوا فيها، بحيث ان هم يقدروا يزودوا الاعداد تاني، بحيث ان هم يقدروا يطلقوها في البريه تاني. لو سابوها كده هم مش هيقدروا ان هم الكائن ممكن ينقرض. ده ملخص سريع جدا يعني عرضتها. Thank you, Dr. Heather. You can proceed.
Thank you. Okay, I might answer a couple of questions, or try to anyways. So one question is, how can habitat destruction and fragmentation affect wild animal health and accelerate disease transmission? And this is a great question, and I have a good example that I don't have pictures of, but I'll tell you the example. So the example is from Australia, and it's a virus called Hendra virus. So It's distantly related to canine distemper, but it's in the sort of within the paramyxovirus family. But it causes disease in horses, but it can also cause very severe disease in humans. And most of the human cases that happened in Australia, including some human deaths, were from veterinarians that were doing postmortems on horses that were affected by Hendra. So this virus is carried by bats, and it's mostly these fruit bats that live in Australia, and they aren't affected by the Hendra virus. But what happens is that in some areas of Australia, they've cut down all the trees where the bats live, and they've sort of put up farms or had farms grow in those areas. And then it turns out that they put up different types of trees in the areas with the horse farms than in some other areas. So then it turns out that the bats didn't have they used to have a nice home. They used to have forests. They used to have natural places for them to be where they would be feeding on their normal kind of food diet. And then also they weren't necessarily in contact with horses or with people. And so what happens when you cut down all the trees, the flying foxes move. So they're looking for food. So it turns out they went to these horse farms that had some trees on the farm, and that's where the bats were getting food. So they got some food there. And it turns out that we see there's also kind of a link in terms of temperature, and in seasons where there's lots of food for the bats, there'll be natural environments for there to be. They'll be in those natural environments, and they're not going to, be they're not going to be in contact necessarily with horses or people. But then when you remove those areas, remove those trees, you're creating a situation where the bats are very close to the horses. And it turns out that then there's more chance that the virus is going to spill over from an infected bat into a horse and cause disease. And then the humans get the disease, usually from contact with the horse. So that's essentially how. But it's all kind of related to that host pathogen environment triad in terms of more stressors associated, more different types of stressors, pollution, destruction of their habitat. The risks of emerging diseases are higher. And there's actually quite a few examples and quite a few papers on this as well. So the next question is, what practical steps can veterinarians and researchers take to help limit the spread and impact of white nose syndrome? Great question. So we think that white nose syndrome is caused by a fungus, and it is resistant in the environment. And we think that it probably got introduced into the USA because it was on the boots of someone that had been traveling to going to caves in Europe and Asia. So now we know that there's usually some guidance if you're going to go into cave environments, that you actually use certain techniques to make sure that after you come out of the cave, you disinfect your equipment. Some of it can be done. The fungus is deactivated often with really, really hot water, and then certain agents, for example, like bleach, for example. But the really, really hot water tends to actually work in a lot of cases. So if you actually go on the website, and I can probably even share with it later, there's lots of guidance on how you can actually limit the spread. So it means that if you're going, on hikes into natural areas, that you think about things like cleaning your boots after you go, which is also something that you would do as a veterinarian if you're going to visit a farm. So it's thinking about biosecurity. What role can veterinarians play in early detection and monitoring of emerging diseases in invasive reptile populations? That's great. So I think veterinarians can play lots of roles, and I think one of them is, different countries are going to deal kind of with wildlife in different ways. But one thing that you can do is, sometimes the diseases aren't going to show in that invasive population because that pathogens maybe doesn't affect them, but it's going to show in the native population. So it is important to kind of have methods if there are sick and dead wildlife in the environment that you're noticing, that you're able to have some connections possibly with a vet school or scientists, and that, the government is supporting those situations. There is a focus on this globally. So certainly through WOA and through some other organizations, there's a focus on ensuring that there's some capacity. But what you might see are sick and dead reptiles, I guess, in the environment. So what that can look like are animals that are in poor condition. Often in reptiles, they're just going to be, not as active, and they might show signs of difficulty shedding. So they should normally be shedding their skin, right? And if you have patches of skin in certain areas that aren't shedding, that can be an indicator of disease. And then otherwise, you might just notice that there's changes in that population. So there's less of them that you're seeing around. So that would give you kind of a trigger to investigate a little bit further. So, you could also, of course, try to regulate the pet trade, which is really challenging. You could try, what we do is when there is a seizure. So when at the airport, when there's a seizure, we actually investigate those animals, and we can test them for different pathogens, but that can be very expensive. And we don't even necessarily have kind of like a specific government program to fund that, but that would be it's a potential area, I guess, of research if you are able to kind of connect with regulatory authorities and actually test, some animals that are seized, then you might get a better sense of what threats might be there. And this is why for domestic animals, we have rules. For example, you need to do rabies titers on cats and dogs before you import them to Australia, or you need to test for this certain thing in that animal before it moves over here, for example. So especially in kind of reptiles and amphibians, we don't have those rules as well worked out, but often in many cases we're dealing with kind of illegal trade anyways, which is tougher to manage, and really it has to be managed through enforcement. So in terms of how the pet trade is playing a role, and it's because often the animals that are trafficked in the pet trade are not in very good conditions. They're overcrowded. They're really highly stressed as well. A number of them actually die in transport. And when an animal's stressed, it's much more likely to shed disease. That's true of salmonella. That's true of a number of different pathogens. And we don't have those regulations. We're not testing those animals before removing them. Because it's an unregulated trade, we don't know where they're going necessarily, and the risks to the existing wild population are high because there aren't the necessary sort of ways that we can help manage some of the biosecurity. Okay, so I was talking about using vaccines and using different tools for controlling pathogens in the wild, which is it is quite challenging to do, but we actually have a number of new diseases. And for example, we're actually using drones to disseminate some of these oral vaccine baits in some areas as well. So, another kind of really important aspect of wildlife veterinary medicine is understanding threats to species from postmortem. So it is from examining carcasses of dead animals. And that's why having a wildlife health surveillance program in place, so you can investigate, what happens when things go wrong, but you can help inform conservation measures in the future. And so why is that important? So this is a northern right whale. I'm actually in this picture. This is in Nova Scotia in Canada. So this is a highly endangered species. There's only 400 individuals of these left in the wild. And so what did we find out from years of postmortem investigations of these species, which are a considerable amount of work? So you can see that they're a very large animal. It requires a lot of people working very hard for long periods of time to do a postmortem on these animals. But what we have found is that a number of them died because they were hit by boats. And so we were able to kind of feed that information back into regulators and policymakers. And we told them that there should be speed limits for boats in certain areas. So this is the eastern side of the United States and Canada, and they did. So the decreased speed limits in these areas has resulted in much fewer North Atlantic right whale deaths, and there has been somewhat of a recovery of these species. But at the present time, there's some plans from the current US administration to kind of get rid of those speed limits, unfortunately. But it's been a tremendous amount of data over time that has actually been effective in terms of policy changes. And so those speed limits actually are important to the conservation of that species. So this is another example of understanding especially those threats that we know that we can mitigate, for example, by having speed limits. So this is a green turtle carcass. So this is in St. Kitts, and these are the lesions that you see. You can see this is from a propeller. So you get these linear fractures that are evenly spaced just in the carapace or the outer shell of this animal. So this is an example of boat strike happening to a turtle. And there's, again, some thoughts locally about having speed limits at certain times of the year to prevent these things occurring. These pictures got pretty famous a few years ago because we were documenting the impact of plastics on these animals. And so these negative impacts and pictures where we can just have an emotional response to plastics having a negative impact on them and on their health has resulted in policy changes where plastic straw use is being discouraged. So this is a way that we can mitigate certain threats to these species. So having these regular examination and a mechanism to examine animals over time is actually making a difference, even though it can be, difficult to deal with these cases sometimes. So, for example, entanglement in fishing gear and fishing hooks, ingestion in some cases, and just getting caught in the animal happens a lot more with the J hooks. And so there have been some changes where they made the hook a different shape, and it seems to be having somewhat it doesn't get embedded as easily, and so it seems to be some mitigation of the impact. So investigating, the other thing that happens in wildlife health is what we see in the animal. You need to know to kind of look for underlying causes of disease. So this might look like a diseased animal. This is actually the stomach or the proventriculus of a loon. And all of these kind of irregular areas are parts of where a little nematode or worm has kind of buried in the mucosa. But it's actually normal for loons to have this parasite. It's from eating fish. But what we have inside the ventriculus, or this part of the stomach in the loon, is this metal structure. And it turns out that metal structure is fishing weight that has lead in it. So it turns out that a huge mortality factor for loons in many areas is actually lead poisoning. But we wouldn't know that without kind of doing some additional toxin testing. And there have been successful policy changes in some parts of the world. California is one of them, to protect the California condors, which are an endangered species, because there's been many years of data that have shown that lead is negatively impacting those birds, because condors are just like vultures. They're scavengers, and they're exposed to a lot of lead from carcasses kind of left on the landscape. So there have been some positive kind of policy changes associated directly with veterinarians and wildlife health specialists being engaged in documenting and better understanding kind of the threats to wildlife. But you also don't necessarily even have to be a scientist to to make some positive change. There's often opportunities for citizen scientists to participate in population monitoring. There's lots of different ways that you can, help engage with the local environment and monitor for different species, getting to know your local wildlife. And then there's some actual kind of really basic solutions for some wildlife health issues. So chytrid is a fungus that had caused massive population declines in many different frog species worldwide. And it turns out that frogs, because they're ectotherms, they depend on the environment for temperature. The warmer they are, the better their immune system is at dealing with certain things like chytrid. So they can actually survive chytrid if their immune system is doing okay. So there was actually I think it was an undergraduate student in Australia that came up with this idea of creating frog saunas. So essentially they're just bricks with little holes in them so the frogs can hang out there, but the bricks heat up, and so that heats up the frog's body, and then it sort of increases their resistance to chytrid fungus. And it turns out that it's effective. So it's a pretty simple solution. People can kind of put them in their backyards, and it's actually helping the frogs save themselves. It's not putting, more drugs into the environment or anything either, and it's helping the animals overall. So kind of as a summary, these are the main sort of threats to biodiversity. So pollution, overconsumption, invasive species and disease. So I would include kind of like the pet trade essentially within that, habitat destruction and climate change. But I know that all of you are superheroes and champions of biodiversity. So I did want to sort of encourage you and let you know that you can make a difference positively to positive change. And so these are kind of some different ways that everyone can make a difference for biodiversity. And so these were outlined essentially as changes that probably should likely happen by 2030. So what we need to do is start protecting our habitats, so lobbying to make sure that the wildlife have a place to live. It's actually in our best interest to do that, because then we're creating less of a situation that we're going to have more pandemics in the future. So restoring natural habitats, halting human extinction, recovering species populations, stopping exploitation, and to look for more sustainable food practices, clothing practices, agriculture, just more sustainable ways that we can use the environment. And overall, we're going to have a much better human health and well-being, and our health is linked to the health of the environment and the health of animals out there. So I just also kind of wanted to give a sense that wildlife veterinarians can work in many different areas. And some people are definitely kind of still involved in wildlife work, but maybe their main job is focused potentially on domestic animals or something else. They're still kind of engaged in this One Health space. So there's lots of different roles for veterinarians to get involved in wildlife health. These are just kind of a few examples from some different people that have worked in the trade, and so kind of an example of the different types of species and groups that people are working on. So these are all kind of people that are active within the Wildlife Disease Association. Or just a little bit about the association. We were founded in 1951. We have multiple sections. So we do have an Africa and Middle East section, and I wanted to sort of let you know about that. And they actually host a large number of webinars, and they do actually host an annual meeting periodically as well. And so overall, it's a global network of folks that are interested in wildlife health and sustainability. We have a journal that I mentioned, Journal of Wildlife Diseases. So anyone from low to middle income countries actually get free access to the journal. And anyone who's a member of the Wildlife Disease Association can publish for free within the journal. And so you can connect with a global expertise of wildlife health experts, and we're part of this other group called Bio1, which includes a number of kind of smaller ecology or science, biology focused journals as well. So the Wildlife Disease Association Africa and Middle East section is quite active. These are the folks that are in charge. Currently there's a student chapter in South Africa, but there's another student chapter developing in Kenya. And it's something to consider, I guess, is to get potentially more involved in the organization, join this section, get access to webinar. There's many different webinars on a variety of different topics, and become familiar with the group. If you're part of a student chapter, then you can have the student chapters have access to grants. And so those grants can help fund things like workshops, speakers talking about different events, travel to conferences, and a wide variety of kind of some other support. So this is the website for the South African student chapter and the Australasian student chapter, and many of them, it provides opportunities for leadership as well. So you get some experience potentially in leadership opportunities. So feel free to get in touch. We've sort of just started a new initiative to engage more globally. And so we do have an offer where we're offering free membership to low, middle income and upper middle income countries. And so Egypt is included in those. So if you do have to kind of, I think you need to get a code in order to kind of register, and then it'll be free for 2 years and then a discounted membership in the 3rd year, because we want people to sort of stay on board. So if you are interested, I would encourage you to get in touch with this email address, communications@wildlifedisease.org, and engage with us, and start. Once you become a member, then you'll have access to our bi-weekly or every 2 weeks newsletter. There's lots of opportunities. There's lots of job opportunities kind of posted on our website, graduate student opportunities as well. And we also have a conference. I can't remember if I included a sign about the conference. No, but we have a conference that's coming up in Chicago, but there's an online version as well. So you also will be able to register that for free. So it's called the Global Voice, and you can engage. It's going to be happening around the same time as the conference, but it will have a couple of different presentations from around the world on wildlife health. So I would encourage you to kind of get engaged with that as well. So it's called the Global Voice. You can find it on our website. And I guess I just wanted to encourage you to stay engaged in wildlife health and how that can be applied to conservation, because we will need, and we do need, complex solutions. We need lots of folks to care about, wildlife and the environment and environmental health. And we all need to kind of be part of the solution and collaborate together so that we're kind of moving towards more of a One Health and positive future. So I just wanted to kind of end and let you know that what you do makes a difference. So all of the kind of decisions that we make can have a positive change on the world around us. So I look forward to seeing all of you in the future, and wish you, I guess, all the best. And thank you so much for tuning in this evening. And I'll see if I can answer a few questions before people
Thank you.
go.
Thank you so much, Dr. Heather. I will try to translate.
Yeah, go ahead.
الفقرة الأخيرة اللي الدكتور اتكلمت فيها كانت بتتكلم أكتر على فكرة التغيير في الانفايرمنت أو البيئة، وقد إيه هو ممكن يأثر على الكائنات البرية ويعرضها أكتر لأمراض أكتر. كان في جزئية في الفقرة اللي فاتت بتتكلم على الفارت دوج، ده كان اتنقل له أمراض من الكلاب العادية، وده كان أمراض هو ما كانش بيتعرض لها قبل كده، واكتشفوا بعد كده إن هو بيتنقل لهم من الكلاب العادية، ودي كانت مشكلة لأن برضو الكائن ده ما كانش عنده المناعة ضد الباثوجين ده أو المرض ده. وكان في المثال اللي بعد كده اللي كان على الباتس او على الخفافيش لما والهورسز والحصنه لما حصل تغيير في الانفايرمنت بتاع الباتس او في بيئه الخفافيش والشجر اللي كان الخفافيش دي بتعيش فيه تم قطعه باعداد كبيره. الخفافيش دي اضطرت انها تنقل البيئه بتاعتها، وكان اقرب حاجه اتنقلوا ليها كان مزرعه فيها حصنه. المزرعه دي كان فيها شجر كتير، فالباتس راحت عاشت عليها وبدات تعشش فيها، وبالتالي الامراض اللي كانت محمله في الخفافيش دي اتنقلت للحصنه. وتاني الحصنه ما كانش عندها المناعه ضد الامراض دي، لانه ما كانش في كونتاكت قبل كده، وما كانش في اتصال ما كانش فيه اتصال قبل كده ما بين الخفافيش دي او نوع الخفافيش دي والحصنه دي. وده كان من ضمن الدلائل اللي بتقول ان احنا كبشر لما بنغير في الطبيعه في امراض جديده ممكن تنتشر اكتر ما بين الحيوانات، وخاصه ما بين الحيوانات المستأنسه والحيوانات البريه. وعشان كده احنا كمان كوايلد لايف فيتس او كبيطريين للكائنات البريه محتاجين نركز كمان في الفاكتورز او الحاجات اللي بتحصل وبتتغير في بيئة الكائنات البرية. وبعد كده عرضت الاكزامبل بتاع الحيتان الويلز والسلحفة، اظن كانت جرين تيرتل، سلحفة خضراء، انه الكائنات دي تعرضت او بقى بيزيد فيها بيزيد حواليها البوتس او المراكب السريعة، وبالتالي بقت تتعرض اكتر لانها تتضرب بالمراوح بتاعه المراكب دي، وبقت تطلع على الشط بانجريز او بمشاكل كبيره وبتموت على الشط. ولما بيكشفوا عليها او بيعملوا التشريح بيكتشفوا انه هي بتموت من الضربات المراكب السريعه. وبالتالي كان الاتجاه انه يا جماعه ان احنا نركز ان في المناطق اللي احنا عارفين ان فيها حيتان او سلاحف بان احنا بنقلل سرعه المراكب. فالاتجاه اللي الدكتور كانت بتعرضه في الفقره دي انه احنا مش بس بنعرض الامراض او ان احنا بس بنركز في الامراض، لا احنا كمان محتاجين كوايلد لايف فيتس ان احنا نعرف البيئه بتاعت الكائنات دي بتتعرض ليها ايه، هم بيتعرضوا لايه. زي مثلا لما يبقى في بحر او ميه بيزيد فيها نسبه الليد او الرصاص، ده بيبتدي يبان في التشريح بتاع الحيوانات اللي بتموت. وبالتالي احنا محتاجين نركز في نسبه الحاجات دي لما بتزيد في الانفايرمنت، لان هي الدليل لينا احنا هنعالج الكائنات دي بعد كده ازاي. فالملخص ان احنا محتاجين نركز في البيئة والتغيرات اللي بتحصل فيها، محتاجين ان احنا نركز في الافكت بتاعنا احنا كبشر على البيئة، احنا بنتسبب في ايه، محتاجين نركز في التعاملات ما بين الكائنات المستأنسة والكائنات البرية، لان هما الاتنين بيختلطوا ببعض، بينقلوا الامراض لبعض، ومش دايما كل الكائنات هيبقى عندها المناعة ضد يعني ضد الامراض اللي بتنتقل دي. فاحنا كوال لايف بيتس مش بس بنشرح، مش بس بنشوف الباثوجين، احنا محتاجين نفهم البيئة ونفهم الحاجات اللي بتتغير فيها عشان نقدر ان احنا نعالج الكائنات صح، علشان نقدر ان احنا نمنع انتشار الأوبئة، وعلشان احنا كمان كبشر ما يتنقلناش الامراض. ده كان ملخص اخر فقرة الدكتور اتكلمت فيها. Thank you so much Dr. Heather. Thank you so much for your time. As we conclude this exceptional session, we would like to express our deepest gratitude to Dr. Heather Fenton for sharing her valuable expertise, scientific insights, and inspiring perspectives on wildlife health and disease. Today's discussion highlighted how closely the health of wildlife is connected to biodiversity conservation, ecosystem resilience, and our broader understanding of environmental change. It also reminded us that protecting wildlife requires not only scientific knowledge, but also international collaboration, field experience, and continuous learning. We're especially grateful to the Wildlife Disease Association for supporting opportunities like this and for its important role in connecting experts, researchers, and young professionals working toward a healthier future for wildlife and ecosystems worldwide. At DialoGreen, we deeply value this collaboration and the opportunity to provide students and young environmental leaders with direct access to internationally recognized expertise and real conservation dialogue. Thank you so much. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you so much, Dr. Heather, for engagement and passion for biodiversity and wildlife conservation. We look forward to welcoming you again in future Dial Nature sessions. Thank you so much, Dr. Heather.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Shukran. Did I say that right? So shukran.
Yes, you said it right. Thank you so much. Shukran.
Thank you.
Thank you.